It was a bright morning in New York City, and the streets outside the ABC studio were already filled with people holding phones and cameras. They weren't there for just anyone. Word had spread quickly that Keanu Reeves was going to appear live on The View, one of the most popular talk shows on television. Fans lined up early, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Hollywood star whose quiet charm and kindness had earned him love from people all around the world. Inside the studio, the atmosphere was full of energy. The crew moved around, checking lights, sound, and camera angles. Producers whispered to each other about timing and segments. Everyone was excited. Having Keanu Reeves on the show was always a big deal. He wasn't like most celebrities. He didn't chase attention. He didn't cause drama. He was calm, thoughtful, and seemed to carry a kind of peace that people felt even through the screen. Backstage, Keanu waited quietly, sipping water from a paper cup. He wore simple clothes, a dark jacket, jeans, and his usual boots. There was nothing flashy about him, but somehow his presence drew attention anyway. He smiled politely at everyone who passed by. One of the crew members nervously asked for a photo, and he agreed without hesitation, leaning in slightly so she could take a good shot. He wasn't promoting a big superhero movie or some action-packed sequel this time. He was there to talk about a smaller film he had worked on, a story about loss, healing, and finding peace after hardship. The movie reflected a lot of what people already admired about him: depth, empathy, and humility. As he waited, he could hear the familiar voices of the hosts echoing faintly from the stage. They were in the middle of a segment talking about current news. He smiled faintly. He had seen The View before. It was known for its strong opinions, lively debates, and sometimes a little bit of chaos. But Keanu wasn't worried. He had been through much tougher interviews. He always handled himself with quiet grace. When a producer came to get him, he stood, straightened his jacket, and nodded. "Let's do this," he said softly. The studio lights were bright as he stepped onto the stage. The audience erupted into cheers. Some people even stood up, clapping as if they were greeting an old friend. Keanu smiled shyly and waved, his eyes crinkling in that familiar, gentle way that fans loved. The hosts greeted him warmly, each one expressing how thrilled they were to have him there. "Welcome, Keanu. It's so good to see you," said one of the hosts, her voice full of genuine excitement. "Thank you," he replied simply, his tone soft and kind. They started with light questions. How was he doing? What was it like returning to smaller, emotional films after the action-packed projects he was known for? Keanu talked about storytelling, about how every film gave him a chance to learn something new, not just as an actor but as a human being. He spoke slowly, thinking before each word. The audience listened closely, drawn in by his sincerity. He shared stories from the set, laughing quietly at small moments of humor. He talked about the director, the cast, and how the movie reminded him of what really mattered in life: connection, compassion, and understanding. His voice carried warmth, and every time he smiled, the crowd seemed to relax even more. One of the hosts commented on how calm he always seemed. "You have this peace about you," she said. "How do you stay so grounded in an industry that's so noisy and competitive?" Keanu smiled again, a little embarrassed by the compliment. "I don't really think about it that way," he said. "I just try to stay present. Life's short, you know. We meet so many people and everyone's going through something, so I just try to be kind." There was a small round of applause from the audience. His words felt real, not rehearsed or polished, just honest. It was one of the reasons people loved him so much. As the conversation went on, he opened up about how fame had changed over the years. He talked about social media, privacy, and how the world had become louder and faster. "Sometimes," he said, "I think people forget how powerful silence can be. We don't always need to have an opinion on everything. Sometimes it's okay just to listen." The hosts nodded, impressed. It was the kind of thoughtful answer they had expected from him. Everything was flowing smoothly. The tone was friendly and relaxed. The audience was engaged, and Keanu was his usual humble self. Backstage, producers smiled. The segment was going perfectly. But little did anyone know, the calm atmosphere would soon take a turn no one expected. For now, though, everything still felt easy and comfortable. The discussion turned toward his new film again, the themes of loss, reflection, and hope. He talked about how the story connected with real human experiences, and how he believed movies could heal people in small ways. Stories remind us that we're not alone, he said. Even when life feels hard, there's always someone who's been through something similar. The host sitting across from him nodded. That's a beautiful way to look at it, she said. I think that's one reason audiences connect with you so deeply. You bring that realness to everything you do. He gave a modest smile and looked down for a moment, almost shy about the praise. I just try to do my best, he replied quietly. The conversation moved to lighter topics: travel, books he'd been reading, even his love for motorcycles. The audience laughed when he described the feeling of freedom he got while riding, how it cleared his mind. He said it was one of the few times he could just be alone with his thoughts without distraction. I guess that's my version of meditation, he said, smiling. By then, the audience felt completely connected to him. The hosts were relaxed, the laughter felt genuine, and the studio had that rare warmth that made live television feel intimate. During a short break, Keanu leaned back slightly in his chair, sipping water and exchanging a few light comments with one of the co-hosts. He seemed at ease. The staff handed him cue cards for the next segment, but he didn't even glance at them. He preferred to just talk naturally from the heart. When the cameras turned back on, applause filled the room again. The producer's voice echoed faintly through the speakers. We're live in 3, 2, 1. The host picked up where they left off, asking about how the experiences in his life had shaped his views on happiness and success. Keanu paused before answering, taking a moment to think. I think happiness isn't something we chase, he said finally. It's something that happens in small moments. When you help someone, when you laugh with a friend, when you feel grateful. Success is nice, but it's not everything. I've learned that peace of mind is more valuable. The studio was quiet for a few seconds after that, the kind of silence that means people are really listening. It was clear his words had landed deeply. He went on to talk about empathy, how the world needed more of it. We never really know what someone's going through, he said softly. So I think it's important to be gentle with people, even if we disagree with them. The hosts nodded again, visibly touched by his perspective. At that moment, Keanu looked perfectly content. He had shared what mattered to him. The audience was engaged, and everything seemed calm. But sometimes on live television, calm doesn't last long. Behind the scenes, producers were preparing for the next discussion topic. They like to keep the show dynamic, a mix of light conversation and deeper debate. They wanted to shift from film and personal philosophy to something a little more current, something that would spark conversation, as they like to say. But Keanu didn't know that yet. From where he sat, everything still felt warm and safe. He laughed at a small joke one of the hosts made about how his movies always make people cry. He replied, If a story makes someone feel something real, then I think that's a good thing, even if it makes them cry. The crowd laughed softly. By then, it was clear why people often described Keanu as different. He didn't talk like most celebrities. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just spoke like an ordinary person who happened to be famous. One of the stage assistants quietly signaled that the next topic was coming up after a short clip. The lights dimmed slightly as the screen behind the hosts played a short montage from Keanu's film. The scenes were emotional, quiet moments of reflection, a few lines of dialogue about forgiveness and healing. When it ended, the audience clapped again. Keanu smiled gratefully. Thank you, he said simply. Everything still seemed fine. The atmosphere was good, the hosts were friendly, and the audience was clearly moved. He had no idea that the tone of the conversation would shift in the next few minutes, and that shift would change the mood of the entire show. But for now, the energy in the room was light. The hosts joked about his timeless look, asking if he had a secret for staying youthful. He laughed, shaking his head. I just drink water and try to sleep when I can, he said, making everyone laugh again. Even the cameras seemed to capture the softness of that moment. A man who had lived through fame, loss and success, sitting calmly under the studio lights, just being himself. In that short time, Keanu reminded everyone watching why they admired him so much. It wasn't just the movies or the fame. It was the way he carried himself, humble, thoughtful, and kind. No one in the room could have guessed that in the next segment, the conversation would take a sharp turn, leading to one of the most surprising moments in the show's history, but that was still ahead. Right now, it was just Keanu being Keanu, Gentle, honest, and quietly magnetic, surrounded by bright lights, applause, and a room full of people who couldn't help but smile when he did. And for that brief period before anything changed, it felt like the whole studio was sharing a rare moment of peace in a world that rarely stopped to breathe. As the segment continued, the mood on set was still light. The hosts were smiling, the audience was engaged, and Keanu Reeves seemed at ease. He leaned forward slightly, gesturing as he spoke about how his life philosophy had shaped his work. The discussion was flowing, and no one could have predicted that in just a few moments the atmosphere would shift dramatically. The transition came suddenly, almost without warning. One of the hosts, who had been listening quietly up until this point, leaned forward and changed the course of the conversation. She spoke up with a question that would soon make everyone uncomfortable. Keanu, you've been in the industry for so long now. People love your movies and you've had incredible success. But recently we've seen a lot of celebrities getting more vocal about politics, social issues, and the responsibility they feel to speak out. Do you think that stars have an obligation to use their platform for activism? The question hung in the air for a moment. Keanu didn't immediately respond. He looked down briefly as if thinking it through. The studio felt quieter than before, the energy starting to shift. I think people have the right to speak out on what they believe in, Keanu said slowly, his voice still calm. But I also think there's more than one way to make a difference. The host nodded, some appearing satisfied with his answer. But then Joy Behar, one of the show's most outspoken and opinionated hosts, leaned in. She didn't seem convinced. Her voice was a little sharper than before. Right, but don't you think that in this day and age, silence can almost be seen as complicity? We're living through a time where things feel so divided. People need to know where you stand, Joy said, her gaze fixed on Keanu. It's not enough just to stay neutral anymore, is it? Keanu seemed to pause again, his face remaining composed but his brow furrowed just slightly. He had dealt with these kinds of questions before, whether it was about his personal life or his approach to fame. He had always tried to keep a certain distance from the noise of the world, believing that actions often spoke louder than words. But this was different. The tension in the air was undeniable. I think silence doesn't necessarily mean complicity, Keanu replied carefully. There's a difference between choosing to speak out and just choosing not to engage in every issue that comes up. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is just listen. There was a brief moment of quiet in the studio, a slight tension in the air that wasn't there before. The audience, who had been laughing and clapping moments earlier, now sat in a more subdued silence, unsure of how the conversation was shifting. Joy didn't back down. She pressed on. But how can you just listen when there are so many injustices happening? Don't you feel the need to take a stand? To make sure people know you're on the right side? Keanu's expression didn't change. He leaned back slightly, his posture still relaxed, but his words were more deliberate this time. I understand what you're saying, Joy, but I believe that action speaks louder than words. I've always tried to live my life by example, by doing the right thing even when no one's watching. The studio was getting quieter, and the hosts seemed more uneasy. Keanu's answer, while thoughtful, wasn't the kind of fiery, outspoken response they might have expected. The tension between him and Joy was growing. Joy's frustration was becoming more evident as she tried again. You say you live by example, but does that mean you think it's okay to stay silent while other people are risking everything to speak out? While there are issues affecting people every day, issues that demand attention? Keanu's eyes narrowed just a bit, and for the first time there was a slight edge to his voice. It's not about staying silent. It's about choosing how to speak and when to speak. I think a lot of the time people get caught up in the noise in the rush to take a side, but there are different ways to help people. You can give back quietly, without needing to make a big statement. You can do the work without feeling the need to be in the spotlight. Joy wasn't finished. She crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow, clearly not satisfied with his answer. I get that, Keanu, but don't you think there's a point where staying quiet can be seen as standing by while others suffer? Keanu paused, his expression soft but firm. He wasn't angry, but it was clear that the conversation was beginning to push him in a direction he wasn't comfortable with. He shifted slightly in his chair and gave a small, almost imperceptible sigh. I'm not saying people shouldn't speak out, but I'm saying that there's value in listening, in understanding before jumping to conclusions. There's always more to a situation than what we see at first glance. I don't think that means being complicit, he said quietly, his voice steady despite the tension. I think it's about being thoughtful, and sometimes that requires not rushing to speak. The tension in the room was now palpable. Joy, who was known for her directness and strong opinions, didn't seem to be ready to let it go. She leaned in, her eyes fixed on Keanu. So you're saying that even in the face of injustice, you'd rather stay quiet? She asked, her voice now more pointed. That seems like a pretty neutral stance to me, and I'm not sure that's enough right now. Keanu's face remained calm, though it was clear this line of questioning was pushing him to the edge. He wasn't here to have a heated argument, but it was becoming harder to stay in the conversation without feeling a sense of frustration rising within him. Still, he held his ground. I'm not saying I'd stay quiet in the face of injustice, he replied, his voice now a little firmer. But I think there's more to making a difference than just taking a side. Sometimes people think being loud is the only way to be heard. But there are other ways to affect change. People can do things without needing to shout about it. And they can help others without putting themselves in the spotlight. The other hosts, who had been mostly quiet throughout the exchange, were beginning to shift in their seats. They could see the situation escalating, and they seemed unsure of how to steer it back to calmer waters. Keanu was still composed, but the conversation was veering into uncomfortable territory. Joy didn't seem ready to back down. But Keanu, in a world where so much is happening, protests, social movements, people fighting for their rights, don't you think there's an ethical responsibility to speak up? If you don't, what message are you sending to your fans, to the world? Keanu exhaled slowly, his expression still steady. It wasn't just the question itself that was weighing on him. It was the pressure to be something he wasn't. He wasn't a celebrity who lived for the drama or the attention. He wasn't someone who played the political game. He believed in doing good in the world, but on his own terms, not on anyone else's. I'm not saying it's not important to speak up for what's right, he said carefully, his voice quieter now, but I don't think everyone has to do it the same way. We each have our own way of contributing. For me, it's about kindness, humility, and trying to help where I can. Some people use their platform to speak out publicly. I use mine to try to make a difference in smaller, quieter ways. By now, the tension was undeniable. Keanu was clearly feeling uncomfortable, but Joy wasn't about to let the conversation end there. She continued pressing, asking him about whether he thought celebrities had a responsibility to speak out on specific issues. The studio audience was quieter now, sensing the shift in the conversation. Keanu's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Joy's more forceful approach. The energy in the room had changed, and it was clear that both parties were becoming frustrated. Keanu took a deep breath, his eyes briefly closing as he composed himself. I believe that everyone has the right to speak out on the things they care about. But I also believe that there's more than one way to do good in the world, he said, his voice still even. Sometimes the loudest voices aren't the ones that make the biggest impact. The tension was now at its peak, and even the other hosts seemed to realize that the conversation wasn't going to settle easily. The quiet that followed was a sharp contrast to the lively, light-hearted tone of the earlier part of the interview. Joy, not wanting to let it go, took one last shot. I just don't know if that's enough, Keanu. I really don't. Keanu sat back in his chair, his eyes steady, his posture relaxed, but there was a clear finality in his voice when he spoke again. I think we all have our own way of making a difference, Joy. For me, it's not about being loud. It's about doing the work, being kind, and trying to help people in my own way. It was clear that the conversation had reached an impasse. The hosts looked at each other, unsure how to move forward. Keanu had made his point, but the tension in the room lingered. At that moment, the conversation shifted again. The tension in the room was growing by the second. Keanu Reeves, who had always been known for his calm and collected demeanor, was now visibly uncomfortable. His usual quiet presence had taken on a more serious edge, and the light-hearted conversation that had started the interview seemed to be slipping away, replaced by something more complicated. As Joy Behar continued to press him on the topic of activism and social responsibility, the atmosphere in the studio had shifted. What had once been a relaxed, casual conversation now felt more like a battle of wills. Keanu, for the first time during the interview, appeared to be struggling with the direction the discussion had taken. The other hosts, who had been mostly silent up until this point, were starting to sense the discomfort in the air. They exchanged quick glances, each of them unsure how to ease the tension or steer the conversation back to safer waters. But it was clear that Keanu wasn't backing down and Joy wasn't either. The discussion had reached a point where both were firmly planted in their views. "Keanu, I understand where you're coming from," Joy said. Her tone now more measured, but there was still a sharpness to her words. "But don't you think that in these times silence can be seen as a form of ignorance? We're living through a global crisis, climate change, inequality, political corruption, and people are looking to those with a platform to speak out. Don't you think it's important for you, as someone with such a big audience, to say something?" Keanu's expression remained neutral, but there was a slight tightening around his eyes. He had expected some pushback during the interview, but the intensity of the conversation was starting to take its toll. He shifted in his seat, clearly trying to maintain his calm, but the words were getting harder to form. "I think it's important to be thoughtful," he said quietly, his voice still steady. "I'm not saying that people shouldn't speak out. I just think that people can contribute in different ways. Some people speak loudly and others do the work quietly. Both are valid." Joy leaned forward again, clearly not convinced. "But Keanu, you're saying that you don't feel that personal responsibility to speak out when things are so urgent? When things are so dire?" Keanu looked at her for a moment, as though he were trying to find the right words to respond. He knew that in the eyes of many, his position might appear as avoidance or indifference, but that wasn't his intention. He wasn't trying to ignore the issues that needed attention. He just believed there were other ways to contribute, quieter ways, that didn't always have to be tied to public declarations or media campaigns. "I'm not saying it's not urgent," he responded, his voice softer now. "I think there's a way to show up for people without putting a target on your back. I try to help where I can, whether it's through charity or supporting causes I believe in. It's just that for me it's never been about shouting the loudest." For a brief moment there was silence in the studio. The hosts sat back, some of them seemingly unsure of how to move forward. The crowd, which had been so engaged earlier, was now quieter, sensing that the conversation had taken a turn. Some people in the audience might have expected Keanu to jump into the fray with more fiery words, but instead, he had maintained a calm resolve. Joy, however, wasn't backing down. She shifted in her chair, clearly unwilling to let the topic go. "I get that, Keanu, I do. But at what point does doing good become more about your personal comfort and less about helping the people who need it? When the world is in crisis, shouldn't we be doing more than just staying comfortable?" Keanu exhaled slowly, and it was clear that he had reached a crossroads. He wasn't used to these kinds of confrontations, not in this setting at least. He had spent most of his career avoiding drama, staying out of the spotlight as much as possible, and focusing on the things that mattered to him. But now, in the middle of this heated discussion, he found himself questioning whether he should have said more. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean by comfort," Keanu replied, his voice still measured, though there was a hint of frustration creeping in. "I've worked hard in my life to stay true to myself, and for me that means being real. It doesn't mean being flashy or taking on issues just because they're trending. It means showing up for people in the ways that I can." Joy looked at him for a moment, her lips pressed together, as if considering how best to challenge him again. She didn't want to let the conversation end here, and Keanu could tell that she was struggling to find the right angle to push him further. "Okay, but don't you see how your position might be seen as not doing enough? People look up to you, Keanu. They admire you because you're seen as genuine, kind, and humble. But what happens when people in positions of privilege like yours don't speak out? What message does that send to your fans?" Keanu took a deep breath, clearly trying to keep his emotions in check. He had been asked similar questions before, but the directness of Joy's approach made him feel cornered. He wasn't prepared to argue about his beliefs on public television, but he also wasn't going to back down from what he knew to be true. "I don't think not speaking out is the same as not doing enough," he said finally. "There's more than one way to make a difference. I'm not saying I don't care about the issues that matter. I'm just saying that I believe actions speak louder than words. Sometimes it's about being there for the people who need it, without trying to make it all about yourself." There was another pause, and the room felt charged with tension. The rest of the hosts had gone quiet, unsure of how to diffuse the situation. Keanu's words had clearly struck a chord with the audience, and for the first time, it was clear that the conversation wasn't going to be neatly wrapped up with a handshake and a smile. Joy, who had been focused on the idea that silence could be harmful, seemed to soften a little. I see what you're saying, Keanu. But I think you'll agree it's just hard to see so many people suffering and not want to do something more. It's not always about comfort. It's about the urgency of the moment. Keanu nodded, his expression thoughtful. He knew that Joy was coming from a place of passion, even if her approach had felt more confrontational than he was used to. He had always respected people who stood up for what they believed in, even if their beliefs didn't align with his own. But in this moment, he was certain that his way was right for him. I understand the urgency, Keanu said quietly, and I'm not suggesting that people shouldn't speak out or get involved. But I think there's room for both. For those who are loud and those who work quietly, we don't all have to fight the same battles in the same way. There was a long silence in the studio. The air had shifted from tense to reflective. The audience seemed unsure of how to react, some still processing Keanu's words, others unsure how to interpret the conversation. The energy was different now, less like an interview and more like an open debate. The hosts, sensing the need to move the conversation along, finally stepped in to shift gears. One of them cleared her throat and smiled, trying to lighten the mood. Well, I think it's clear we're not going to solve all the world's problems in one interview, she said with a chuckle. But Keanu, we do appreciate you sharing your perspective. It's always good to hear from someone who is so thoughtful about the world. Keanu smiled back, grateful for the attempt to diffuse the tension. Thank you, he said simply. Joy, though still visibly invested in the conversation, nodded. I think we'll agree to disagree on some points, but I do respect your views, Keanu. I appreciate that, Keanu replied. I think it's important that we can have these discussions, even if we don't always agree. The conversation had changed from what had initially been a lighthearted interview to a more complex discussion about personal responsibility, activism, and the role of celebrities in today's world. It wasn't the conversation Keanu had expected when he first stepped onto the set of The View, but it was one that had revealed something deeper, something that spoke to the core of who he was. As the conversation shifted once again to lighter topics, Keanu seemed to breathe a little easier. The discussion had taken its toll on him, but he had held his ground. It was clear to everyone in the room that he wasn't someone who shied away from difficult questions. He simply chose to approach them on his own terms. And in that moment, as the interview moved forward, Keanu's calm strength was more apparent than ever. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but he was undoubtedly one of the most genuine. And even though the conversation had gotten heated, his quiet resilience had made it clear that he would never be swayed from what he believed was the right way to make a difference in the world. After the tense exchange, the atmosphere on set felt quieter, almost as if everyone was waiting for something to break the stillness. Keanu had made his point, and although the conversation hadn't reached a perfect conclusion, there was a sense that the issue had been put to rest, at least for now. The conversation about activism, personal responsibility, and the role of public figures in times of social unrest had clearly struck a chord. For Keanu, it wasn't just about the words he had spoken, but the way the conversation had unfolded that left him thinking. He had always believed that actions spoke louder than words, and while he had tried to express that point, it had been met with challenges that were harder to ignore. The rest of the interview moved on, but the energy in the room was still thick. The other hosts, though they seemed to want to steer the conversation back to safer topics, were also affected by the exchange. Everyone in the studio knew that something significant had just happened, even if it hadn't been the most dramatic moment of the show. Keanu, ever the professional, tried to refocus his mind. He had a job to do after all, and that was to connect with the audience. His reputation had always been built on kindness, humility, and sincerity, not on grandstanding or shouting opinions. And despite the difficult conversation, he knew that staying grounded and true to himself was the key to weathering any storm, public or personal. One of the hosts, sensing the opportunity to change the subject without creating more tension, spoke up with a softer tone. So, Keanu, she began, let's switch gears a little bit. You've been a part of some of the most iconic movies of the past few decades. What's it like to see the way your work has impacted so many people? Keanu, thankful for the change in direction, smiled. The question was simple, and it allowed him to relax a bit. He leaned back in his chair, settling into a more comfortable position. Well, it's a little surreal, honestly, he said, his voice light and easy. "I never really set out to make a big impact. I just do the work, and if it resonates with people, then that's amazing. But the way people have connected with my characters, especially in the John Wick series, has been incredible." His tone was genuine, but it was clear that this kind of question was more familiar to him. The conversation about his movies, his approach to acting, and his role as a public figure were things he was more used to discussing. He could feel the room begin to settle, the tension lifting as the hosts eagerly leaned in to hear more. "I think what's special about the John Wick character," Keanu continued, "is that he's not your typical action hero. He's broken. He's flawed. And yet there's something about his determination and the way he deals with loss that people really connect to. I never expected him to become so beloved, but I'm really grateful for how the audience has responded." The host nodded in agreement. "I think a lot of people relate to John Wick in a way that they don't always with other action heroes," one of them remarked. "It's like they see themselves in him. The grief, the desire for redemption, why, it's real, not just for the screen." Keanu smiled softly. "Yeah, I think that's what makes the character so human. You can see that he's not invincible. He's vulnerable, but he keeps pushing forward. And I think that's something people can relate to, especially in difficult times." The conversation drifted more toward Keanu's experience on set, his approach to his roles, and how his career had evolved over the years. As the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere began to feel lighter again. It was clear that Keanu was in his element when the talk turned to his craft. There was a certain peace in his demeanor when he spoke about the art of acting, how he approached each role, how he prepared for a scene, and how he made sure that every character was as authentic as possible. But even though the focus had shifted away from the earlier tension, Keanu couldn't entirely shake the feeling that the discussion had left an impact on him. He wasn't used to debates like that, and he certainly wasn't used to being pushed on such personal beliefs, especially in such a public setting. It was the kind of conversation he normally avoided, preferring instead to let his actions speak for themselves. In fact, as the interview continued, he found his thoughts drifting back to the earlier moments when he had been questioned about his stance on social issues and activism. The words still echoed in his mind, the sharpness in Joy's tone, the challenge to his beliefs. He knew that in some ways they were right. There was a sense of urgency in the world that couldn't be ignored. The issues were real. The suffering was real. And yet he still believed that there was value in doing good without needing to broadcast it to the world. But as much as he believed in that, he also understood the importance of speaking up when it mattered. He wasn't entirely sure what the right balance was, but he knew he would continue to figure it out, in his own way. And maybe, just maybe, that was all anyone could ask for. By the time the interview was nearing its end, the earlier discomfort had faded, replaced by a sense of familiarity and warmth. Keanu's charm and authenticity had once again won the day, even if the conversation had taken an unexpected turn. His ability to stay calm and centered despite the pressure was something that had always defined him. He wasn't perfect and he was human after all, but that was part of what made him so relatable to his fans. The hosts, now much more relaxed, started to wrap up the conversation. "Keanu, it's been such a pleasure having you here," one of them said, smiling warmly. "You're always so grounded, and we really appreciate you sharing not just your thoughts on acting but your perspectives on life. It's not every day we get to have such an honest and real conversation." Keanu returned the smile, his eyes softening. "Thank you," he replied. "I've really enjoyed being here. It's been a good conversation even when it got a little intense." He chuckled, a lightheartedness returning to his voice. "But I guess that's part of being human, right?" The audience, who had been quietly observing the exchange, now responded with applause. It was clear that despite the tension earlier in the interview, Keanu had left a lasting impression. His authenticity, his calm, and his thoughtful approach to the questions had won the day. He wasn't just a movie star. He was a person who was willing to engage, even in the most difficult conversations. As the interview concluded, Keanu stood up, exchanging handshakes and warm smiles with the hosts. The conversation about activism and responsibility may have been uncomfortable at times, but it had been real. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Keanu had stayed true to himself, and no matter how hard the questions got, he had weathered the storm with grace and humility. Walking off set, Keanu couldn't help but reflect on the interview. It wasn't the kind of conversation he had expected to have when he agreed to appear on The View. But it was one that had reminded him of the complexity of the world we live in, and the complexity of being a public figure in it. Keanu wasn't a person who sought out conflict or confrontation. He didn't want to be at the center of a media firestorm, and he certainly didn't want to be seen as someone who was promoting a specific agenda. But at the same time, he knew that there were moments when it was important to stand firm in what you believed, even if it meant facing difficult questions. As he made his way back to his car, Keanu felt a sense of peace. He hadn't been able to change anyone's mind that day, and he hadn't solved the world's problems. But he had spoken his truth, and that was all he could do. The world was full of people who shouted their opinions, who demanded attention for their causes. But there were also those who quietly went about their work, doing good in their own way without the need for applause or recognition. Keanu had always been one of those people, and no matter how many interviews he did or how many questions he faced, that would never change. As the car doors closed and he sat back, the weight of the conversation seemed to fade away. There was a sense of quiet satisfaction in knowing that he had remained true to himself, even when the world seemed to want something else. After the interview, Keanu couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. There was a sense of relief now that it was over, but also a lingering thought in the back of his mind. The conversation had shifted him in ways he hadn't expected. While he wasn't the kind of person who spent much time reflecting on what others thought of him, this conversation had sparked something deeper in him. He wasn't just thinking about how people perceived his stance on activism. He was thinking about the way the world was changing and the responsibility that came with it. It wasn't the first time he'd faced criticism or questioning. Over the years, Keanu had dealt with his fair share of media scrutiny, much of it related to his personal life and his choices as an actor. But this conversation had been different. It wasn't about who he was dating or how he handled fame. It was about something far bigger, the role he played in the world. Keanu sat in the back of the car watching the city pass by outside the window. He wasn't the kind of person who typically let things bother him for too long, but today felt different. The conversation with Joy and the others on The View had forced him to confront the question of activism in a way he never had before. The issue wasn't just about speaking out or staying silent. It was about what it meant to use his platform or not use it, in a world that seemed to be asking for more from those with a voice. As the car made its way through the streets, Keanu thought about all the causes he had supported over the years, from environmental conservation to humanitarian efforts. He had always preferred to work behind the scenes, helping where he could without seeking attention. But lately the world had seemed to demand more. It was as if the expectation for public figures had shifted from merely contributing to actively leading the charge for change. He wasn't sure where he stood on that, but the question lingered. He'd spent most of his life trying to avoid the spotlight, focusing on what he could do without drawing too much attention to himself. His fame, though immense, was something he had always kept at arm's length. Keanu had always believed that true change came from the grassroots level, from people working in their communities, making small but meaningful contributions. But now, the world seemed to be saying that if you had the power to reach millions, you had the responsibility to speak up, to lead. The car pulled up to his destination, snapping Keanu out of his thoughts. He stepped out, grateful for the quiet of his home awaiting him. As he entered his front door, he felt the weight of the conversation begin to lift. There was something comforting about the familiar surroundings of his house. The books on the shelves, the artwork on the walls, the peacefulness of being alone. He knew that no matter what had happened in the interview, his life would continue. He had always found solace in the simple things, in the things that grounded him, but that didn't mean the questions would go away. Over the next few days, Keanu tried to keep his mind busy. He went to the set of his latest film, catching up with his co-stars and immersing himself in his work. But the question that had been raised during the interview stayed with him. Could he do more? Should he be doing more? It wasn't that he hadn't thought about these issues before, but the directness of Joy's questioning had forced him to really examine his own role in the larger picture. Keanu had always been a deeply empathetic person. His compassion for others wasn't something he put on for show. It was part of who he was. He had witnessed hardship in his own life, and he had seen the way that people could come together in times of crisis. But he also understood that activism, when done poorly or without thought, could sometimes do more harm than good. He didn't want to be another celebrity spouting off opinions for the sake of being relevant. He wanted to make a difference, but he wasn't sure how to do that in a way that felt true to himself. One evening, after a long day of filming, Keanu sat in his living room, reflecting on his life. He thought about the charities he had supported, the people he had helped in small personal ways. He wasn't someone who needed recognition for these things, but he also knew that they often went unnoticed. That was fine with him. He had never been the type to seek out praise, but as the world became increasingly interconnected, as social media made everyone's life more public, he began to wonder if his quiet approach was enough. Keanu wasn't a man who shied away from difficult conversations, but there was a part of him that wanted to remain true to the way he had always operated, in the background, doing the work without expecting anything in return. But was that enough anymore? The next day he decided to meet with a few of the people closest to him, his friends, his mentors, and some of the people he worked with in the charity world. He needed to talk it through, to figure out if there was a way forward that felt right for him. As they sat around a table sipping coffee, Keanu opened up about his thoughts. He told them about the interview, about the questions Joy had asked, and about the internal struggle he had been facing since then. He wasn't sure if it was just the pressure of the moment or if it was something deeper, but he knew he needed to talk it out. One of his friends, who had worked with him on several charity initiatives, was the first to speak. "Keanu, you've been doing this for years. You've helped more people than most of us will ever know. You've done the work. You've been there for the people who need it, and you've done it without asking for anything. But I think you're right. The world is changing, and it's okay to step into the light more. It's not about being louder. It's about letting people know that it's okay to care, and that it's okay to use your platform to speak out." Keanu listened quietly, nodding slowly.
He had always admired the humility of his friends and colleagues.
They had been the ones who had pushed him to see the world in different ways, to recognize the power he had, even when he didn't always want it. Another person at the table spoke up, offering a different perspective. "You don't have to be a crusader, Keanu. You've already shown your support for so many causes, but maybe it's time to take a step further. It's okay to be part of the conversation. Your voice matters, and your silence won't help anyone." The conversation continued, with each person offering their insight. Some felt that Keanu had already done enough, while others thought it was time for him to become more vocal. But through it all, Keanu remained calm, listening carefully. It wasn't about agreeing with everything they said, but rather about taking in their thoughts and deciding what resonated with him. By the end of the discussion, Keanu still didn't have all the answers, but he had made a decision. He would find a way to balance his personal beliefs with the need to engage more publicly on the issues that mattered. He wasn't going to change overnight, and he wasn't going to force himself to speak out when it didn't feel right. But he would find a way to continue doing good in the world, quietly if necessary, but also more openly when the time called for it. Keanu left the meeting that day with a sense of clarity. The world was changing, and so was he. He didn't need to be anyone other than who he was, but perhaps he could find a new way to engage with the causes he cared about. Maybe that would mean speaking out more when necessary. Maybe it would mean doing more of the work behind the scenes. Either way, Keanu knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to shy away from his role in this world. The next time he sat down for an interview, he would be ready. Ready to engage, ready to listen, and ready to speak when the moment called for it. Keanu had always believed in the quiet power of action over words, and that was still true. But perhaps there was room for both, for silence and for speaking up when the time was right. And for the first time in a long while, Keanu felt at peace with the complexity of it all.